Econ friends, welcome back. So now you're comfortable with the components of the ADAS model. You know the AD curve, the SRAS, the LRAS. You know their shapes. You know how they look. You know why they look that way. You know how to shift them. Let's put all that knowledge together in this video to look at equilibrium in this model. Once we talk about equilibrium, then we'll do a couple of quick extensions and figure out, for example, within the context of the ADAS model, how we have recessions, how we have inflation, and then from there, how the monetary and fiscal policies that you guys have already been learned about, that you've already been taught, that you've been studying, how those things manifest themselves in this model, okay? So let's use this lecture to really synthesize not just our pieces of the model, but all that previous information on the gaps, the recessionary gap, inflationary gap, the output gaps, recessions and booms and inflations and unemployment and all these things. Let's put them all together right now, okay? So equilibrium in the ADAS model. And basically, my friends, what I want to outline to you or kind of suggest to you is that you should think about the ADAS model as having two distinct equilibrium types. The first one, in this model, we're going to have short-run equilibrium. And short-run equilibrium will occur at the point where AD and SRAS meet. So our first type of equilibrium is going to be short-run equilibrium. This will occur where the AD curve and the SRAS curve intersect. Critically, short-run equilibrium basically represents the economy's current or its actual output right now. On the other hand, our second equilibrium is long-run equilibrium. Long-run equilibrium in this model occurs where the AD, the SRAS, and the LRAS come together. So the long-run equilibrium, another way to see it, it takes the short-run equilibrium and it says, is this short-run equilibrium on the LRAS curve? In other words, is the economy's current actual output the same, more, or less than its potential output? So long-run equilibrium, really critical idea. Again, it's where AD, SRAS, and LRAS all come together. When you achieve long-run equilibrium in this model, several things come together. Number one, your actual output will be equal to your potential output. In other words, like we've said before, there'll be no gap. There'll be no difference between your actual and your potential because by definition, at long-run equilibrium, they're the same. So first thing, you're going to find that actual output will be equal to potential output. We will also see, as an extension of that, that full employment will be achieved. Recall from our unemployment lecture that full employment is when cyclical employment is at zero. And that should make sense. If your actual output is equal to your potential output, then there is no cyclical unemployment. Therefore, full employment is achieved. Remember that full employment is equal, or how about this? An economy hits full employment when it only has frictional and structural unemployment. Think back to your unemployment lectures. And finally, at long-run equilibrium, the actual unemployment rate will equal the natural rate of unemployment. Now, I gave you these three different conditions that occur at long run equilibrium, but you should see by now that fundamentally it's saying the same thing in different ways. When an economy reaches long run equilibrium, there's no gap between potential output and actual output. So there's no recessionary or inflationary tendencies. The economy's working at full capacity. So there's no cyclical unemployment. So you're at the full employment rate. You're at the natural rate of unemployment, which implies that you're at the natural output level. Those things all come together. And these pieces that kind of mean similar things, but in different contexts, they all unite. Best way to see it is just to take a look at it. And you have here this drawing. This is an economy at long run. Actually, let's do it this way to make it really clean. At long run macro equilibrium. You can see here, it all comes together at point E. And you can see that at point E, you have the intersection of, let's do it in green, short run AS and AD. That's your short run equilibrium. And that's occurring at the same point as your long run equilibrium, because that's where it intersects LRAS. Okay, so at this magic point right here, point E, LRAS, SRAS, and AD all meet. Or seen a different way, your short run equilibrium is occurring along your LRAS curve. You get the idea. That's your model. Now, when you see this, this is like the beautiful hypothetical situation. In reality, we never really achieve that. We work toward it, but we never achieve it. So this is the way that you look at the idealized situation. But you understand, of course, that in reality, in the real world of the economy, we're going to have gaps. These gaps occur anytime the economy's short-run equilibrium does not coincide with its long-run equilibrium. In other words, whenever you have a situation where the short-run equilibrium does not fall on the LRAS curve. We have two kinds of gaps. And these two kinds of gaps reflect the difference between the economy's potential output and actual output. And these two types of gaps also represent our two big economic problems of boom and bust, of recession and excessive expansion, of unemployment and inflation. Let's define them. Our first gap is a recessionary gap. And a recessionary gap occurs anytime your short-run equilibrium falls to the left of the LRAS curve. Okay, again, recessionary gap occurs whenever your short-run equilibrium, and remember, short-run equilibrium is where SRAS equals AD, where this intersection point is to the left of the LRAS curve, you've got a recessionary gap. Seen a different way, it implies that actual output is less than potential output. The other gap that we're going to have is known as an inflationary gap. With an inflationary gap, your short-run equilibrium, again, where your short-run AS equals your AD, with an inflationary gap, your short-run equilibrium falls to the right of the LRAS curve. In other words, in this situation, your actual output exceeds your potential output. Now, in earlier lectures, we clarified the fact that in the long run, this is not sustainable. But in the short run, for various reasons, an economy can overproduce past its long-run potential. We also predicted back then that if an economy did that by hiring more workers, by paying more overtime, by running factories double shifts, all these other things, it's going to bid up wage prices and resource prices and drive some inflation, which is why we call it an inflationary gap. Okay. If you look right here, here's a nice little drawing, or actually 3 drawings that will help you make sense of it. Let's first take this one, long run macro equilibrium. I would actually myself add this in just to make it really clean. We'll call that SRAS. Notice that in this first panel, we have SRAS and AD and LRAS all intersecting at the same place right here. This implies that the economy's actual output, its current actual output, is exactly the same as its potential output. It's operating perfectly. On the other hand, right here, we see a different situation. In this one, let's go with some highlighter to kind of get some contrast here. We see that the SRAS and the AD curves, that's our short run equilibrium. Our short run equilibrium is here. If you drop that down, this right here in blue is our actual output. But because our LRAS right here in red represents our potential output, you see that in this second panel, which we're going to call a recessionary gap, the economy's actual output is below its potential. That's that gap right here. And as a result, the economy is underproducing. There's going to be some idle resources, namely unemployment. Not a good thing. And finally, over here in our third panel, we have another situation. Again, we'll use highlighter for contrast. Here you see that our AD curve and our SRAS curve, that's our short run equilibrium. You see that they intersect, that they intersect right here at this dot. You drop a line down, and here in blue, we have the economy's actual output. And it's very obvious if you see that you have your LRAS here, that the economy's actual output in blue is beyond, in excess of, exceeding its potential output in red. That gap here, because the economy is producing too much, would be an inflationary gap. So there you go, my friends. You see the idea of equilibrium. You have 2 types. And fundamentally, the strength of the ADAS model is in comparing the location of the short run equilibrium to the long run. That allows us to determine if we have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap, or if we're operating just right. And of course, once we understand where we are, we can make sense of how we got into the recession or how we got into the inflation, and then we can strategize ways using the model to get out, to stabilize the economy, to get us back to that long-term trend line and away from those fluctuations. Okay? So let's wrap up this lecture with a quick jump into those adjustments. So we know that the ADAS model, it can help us understand the gaps, and that helps us understand not just how recessions and inflation look, but about how they're caused. And once we know how they're caused, we can see how the monetary and fiscal policies that you've already mastered can help fight those things. Okay? Let's start off with the idea of recession. A recession and the underlying unemployment under the ADAS model can only have 2 causes. Number 1, you can have a decline in AD, Or number two, you can have, a decline or a decrease in SRAS. Those are the only two ways, okay? Both of those, you see them right here in panel A and panel B, will cause recession. Panel A shows the impact of a decline in AD. Okay, so panel A is a drop in AD. Here's the way it works. Take a look. You start off right here in blue at long run equilibrium, where SRAS and our original AD and our LRAS are all equal. Then something happens, we don't know what, but we know that something happens that's going to lead to a decline in AD. That's going to shift our AD curve, which I'll do in red, to the left. Now you notice that with this shift to the left, our new equilibrium is here in red. And if you compare the new actual output with the LRAS potential output, you see a recessionary gap, okay? The second way you can have a recession is with a decline in AS. So this is a decline in AS. Same basic idea. Here we're starting again at this point. Long run equilibrium, because LRAS, SRAS, and AD are all equal. And then something happens, we don't know what, but something happens that somehow decreases SRAS, causing it to shift to the left, which I'll do in red. And predictably, as you can now guess, you see a new equilibrium, short run. And if you drop it down, you can see that our new actual output here in red is going to fall short of the LRAS potential output. And once again, we have another recessionary gap, okay? So there's two ways that we can have recessions: a fall in AD or a fall in AS. Just so you know, to economists, this decline in SRAS is the especially dangerous one, because this can lead us to a condition known as stagflation. With stagflation, you get the worst of both worlds. You get output falling and therefore unemployment at the same time that you get inflation rising. So stagflation is a double whammy, and it can really do a number on economies. Now you know how it's caused. Okay, let's now turn to inflation. When you think about gaps and you think about equilibriums, inflation can have two causes. Number one, inflation can be caused by an increase in AD. We call this demand pull inflation. So inflation can be caused by an increase in AD, which we call demand pull inflation, or it can be caused by, again, what we just saw, a decline in SRAS. We would call this cost push inflation, okay? We see right here, we'll go through them really quickly. Same idea in graphs. Let's start with panel A, demand pull inflation. We're starting off, and they didn't put it here, but we can add it in. We start off right here at long run equilibrium. We'll put LRAS here. So we have here long run equilibrium. Everything's beautiful. Then something happens. Let's go to our red, and AD increases, shifting the AD curve out. And you see here a new equilibrium. Now, on the one hand, this new equilibrium is leading to more output. So more people will have jobs and will be producing more. But the big issue here is you can see that this is going to drive up the price level. That's inflation. Okay, let's go over here to panel B, cost push inflation. Let's again start, let's add in, we need to add in an LRAS curve. And you see that we're starting right here at this point in blue with the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of output, the full employment rate, all those things in one area. And something happens, we don't know what it is, but for some reason, SRAS is going to fall. I'm going to shift it to the left. And now you see the new equilibrium in red. And like we learned before, this is stagflation. It's not pretty because not only are we going to have unemployment because of this gap here, but we're also going to see inflation. Okay, so again, to recap it, we can have two causes for inflation: an increase in AD or a decline in SARS. And now you have a sense of how to use this very powerful but simple model to understand how these economic maladies, unemployment and inflation, are caused. And that's important because once you understand the causes, then you can reach into your toolkit and try to solve it. We've already done this for the past couple of weeks in discussing monetary and fiscal policies. You guys are aware of these tools. We call them stabilization policies. Let's now see how those tools make sense in the context of this model. So again, to recap, we know that recession and inflation are two big, let's go to blue here, sorry, are two big economic ills. They can be fought with government stabilization policies. But I also want to bring up to you that on top of the interventionist, more active government policies, there is also a school of thought that says that recessions and inflations, at least in the longer term of the economy, can also self-correct. So I do think it's important that you understand that, at least to some economists in economic theory, there are two ways that we can get out of recessions or inflations. We can have government interventions and stabilization policies, or we can also rely on longer-term self-correction. The stabilization policies, you already know them, my friends. They refer to the expansionary and the contractionary policies, monetary and fiscal, that you've already learned about, okay? When it comes to the self-correction angle, there's this idea that some economists hold called the self-correcting mechanism. In this, it is argued the SRAS will adjust over time, typically in a longer window of time. The SRAS will adjust to return output, in other words, to return real GDP to the economy's natural rate. Okay, let's take a look at how this would play out here. So let's take panel A. Let's start off as always. We have right here, we're starting at this point here. We have SRAS and our original AD. So we have right here in my blue dot, short run equilibrium. This is the economy's actual output. Of course, you know, my friends, that this is not good because the actual output, again, right here in blue, is falling short of the potential output indicated in red at the LRAS. So we've got a recessionary gap, we've got some unemployment, and Congress says we better do something. You know that in this case, they could engage in expansionary policies, expansionary fiscal or expansionary monetary, which in their own different ways would basically increase the AD curve, shifting it to the right, and in a perfect world, putting it right here to this new equilibrium, which is a long-term equilibrium and a nice, perfect place to be. Okay, so that's the way that we would map out expansionary policies. We use them in recessionary gaps to move AD to the right to try to get us from a short-run disequilibrium to a long-term equilibrium. Now, there's also the self-correcting case. Here's how that would play out. Okay, we haven't done this before, so let's take the step-by-steps. Let's assume that we have this recessionary gap. Suppose that we're right here. We're operating here, and our actual output is here in blue. We see that our long-run equilibrium, our long-run AS curve is here in red, and our natural level of output. So you can see right here, the actual situation in blue, the potential in red. So of course we have a gap, recessionary gap. Over here in panel A, again, we argue that we can use government stabilization policies to shift the AD curve to the right. The self-correcting mechanism would say this. Here, we've got this output gap. We have a recessionary gap, and there's a lot of people unemployed. The way that this would play out in the self-correcting mechanism process theory is this high level of unemployment would lead to, over time, existing workers having to accept lower wages. In other words, bosses could say, listen, there's a lot of unemployed people. If you want to keep your job, you need to take a lower wage because the boss himself is making less profit. He may be losing some money, and these expensive workers can be replaced by unemployed workers willing to take a lower wage. So in theory, existing workers would accept a lower wage. That would lower resource costs, lowering wage costs, and that would increase SRAS, shifting it over to the right to here and bringing us back to this point where our actual equals our potential, and we're back at long-run equilibrium, okay? It's a bit more complicated. There's an additional step, and there's a bit more thinking in terms of what's the reaction to the initial situation. But again, the self-correcting mechanism basically argues that whenever you have a gap, there's going to be some sort of change in your SRAS curve. Typically, over a longer period of time, that's going to get the economy back at long-run equilibrium, okay? You can see the same thing here. In panel A, we have a self-correction after a recession. So we start off right here at equilibrium E1, long-run equilibrium. First thing that happens, there's something that's gonna drop AD. So the AD curve is gonna shift to the, let's put this in blue here. It's gonna shift to the left, and that will take us to this new short-run equilibrium, which is obviously to the left of our LRAS. It's a recessionary gap. But again, because of the recessionary gap, because of the higher unemployment, wage levels over time will fall, prices will fall, they'll adjust in the long run, and that adjustment, point number 2, will increase AS, getting us over here and bringing us back here. So we go 1 and then 2. Okay, we see the same thing here when we have a boom in AD. So let's say that we had, again, initial equilibrium here at E1. That's long-run equilibrium. Everything's coming together nice and beautiful. Something happens that's going to increase AD. So step 1, something happens to increase AD, shifting our AD curve over to the right. Let's draw that in here. And that's going to give us a new equilibrium here at E2. Well, you know that this new equilibrium here is to the right of LRAS, so we're going to have an inflationary gap. Well, what's going to happen there? We're going to see overall prices go up, including in the longer term wage prices. Well, when those wage prices go up, and over time, As bosses can adjust, they'll probably hire fewer workers, they'll have to cut back, they'll hire fewer and buy fewer resources, they'll have to cut back, all of which will lead to step 2, a self-correcting fall in SRAS, which will take us right here to E3. So we would have here step 1 and then a self-adjusting step 2. Notice in this self-correction mechanism, I got too excited there. We see something really bad though, because the initial equilibrium corresponded to this price level, and after the adjustment, it's this price level. So a part of the problem with this self-correction mechanism is, even though we'll get back to long-run equilibrium eventually, it will be at a permanently higher price level. In other words, inflation will have taken root and gotten baked into the system, okay? So that's how that works. Like many things in economics, this is frequently debated, okay? Economists debate frequently over a couple of things. Number one, if the self-correcting process even works. And number two, if it does work, how long it takes to work. And number three, even if it does work, depending on how long it takes, they question and debate whether or not self-correction mechanisms or direct government involvement via monetary and fiscal policy are better. Okay, this is an ongoing debate. Unfortunately, a lot of these debates very quickly leave the world of economic theory and tend to get political, with people who advocate increasing government spending and a bigger role for government, typically saying that self-correction takes too long, let's get the government more involved. And people with the more libertarian side, people who want less involvement, saying, hey, the self-adjustment mechanism doesn't take that long, let's rely on that, let the market do what it does, and not rely on government. But again, I'm not here for politics. I wanted to give you an understanding of how this model comes together to both explain the problems that we looked at, recessions and inflations, and to suggest some cures, and to give you a theoretical model for monetary and fiscal policy. This has been a long and a complicated one, my friends. Thanks for tuning in. In our next and final video for this topic, we're going to analyze a couple of periods of American economic history just to really lock in the different situations that we see with the ADAS model. Okay, you've done a great job. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you next time.